Hey guys! Tonight we're settling in with something soft, a little weird, and wonderfully medieval. So, go ahead and dim the lights, curl into whatever blanket situation you've got going on, and let your brain slowly switch itself into low power mode. Because tonight we're taking a calm, meandering walk through Christmas in medieval Europe, where Christmas cheer mixed with cold stone rooms, questionable hygiene, and enough church bells to make your teeth vibrate. And don't worry, this isn't one of those energetic Christmas documentaries with loud music and frantic reenactments. No, we're taking the sleepy route. Think of this as a long, cozy, slightly sarcastic bedtime ramble about how people in the Middle Ages prepared for the biggest holiday of the year without, modern heating, modern medicine, or modern common sense. So, let's float gently into the world of medieval Christmas traditions, where feasting was mandatory, saints were everywhere, and everyone pretended Advent fasting wasn't absolutely miserable. All right, let's drift back in time to somewhere around the 11th, 12th, maybe 13th century. It honestly doesn't matter exactly when, because medieval Christmases were all basically siblings in the same dysfunctional holiday family. And yes, people technically celebrated Christmas long before that, but the medieval version is the one most of us picture when we imagine monks singing in cold, stony halls, peasants dragging logs that look like they weigh as much as a modern SUV, and lords preparing to consume their own weight in roasted animals. So, we'll start there, in the thick of winter. Because, of course, Christmas had to be in late December, right when medieval Europe's favorite pastime was trying not to die of cold. Setting the scene. Winter in medieval Europe. Imagine it. You wake up, and the first thing you see is your own breath trying to escape your mouth like it's quitting your job. Houses are basically wooden boxes with windows that don't actually close unless your idea of closed involves oiled paper flapping sadly in the wind. The cold wasn't just outside. The cold was the house. Stone castles, by the way, even worse. The walls were thick enough to stop a siege engine, but absolutely useless in stopping a breeze. Medieval lords loved to brag about their castles, but none of them bragged about indoor temperature because the average castle in December sat at a refreshing "your toes might fall off." This is the environment people are preparing for Christmas in. So, naturally, let's talk about church. The Advent mood, religious vibes, and mild starvation. Before you got to the fun part, feasting, drinking, singing carols that absolutely did not slap the way later ones would, you had Advent. Advent was a penitential season. That means serious, somber, and no fun allowed. It also meant fasting. Yes, for weeks leading up to Christmas, medieval Christians were supposed to eat less. And not in the modern, I'm being healthy kind of way, more like I'm spiritually cleansing, or I'm trying to earn brownie points for the afterlife kind of way. This meant no meat on many days, no cheese sometimes, and definitely no parties. So, by the time Christmas Eve rolled around, people were starving enough to consider boiled cabbage a delicacy, which is great because medieval cuisine didn't do flavored things anyway. Still, Advent gave the season a calm, reflective atmosphere. Churches were lit by candles, monks chanted softly in the cold, echoing halls, and people tried not to complain about hunger too loudly because complaining wasn't considered holy behavior. You know, classic holiday spirit. Decorating, kind of. Now, medieval people did decorate for Christmas, but if you're imagining shiny ornaments and glitter, please put those mental images away. Christmas decorating medieval style looked more like green branches everywhere, maybe some holly, possibly ivy if you were feeling wild, zero sparkle, zero color coordination, zero concept of aesthetic. People brought greenery indoors mostly because it looked alive, unlike everything else in winter. And yes, some clergy complained about using greenery because it was too pagan. But medieval Europe was basically a tug of war between we love traditions and that looks like sinful witchcraft. So they compromised by continuing to do it anyway. Medieval compromise was basically, we know this is questionable, but we're cold and bored, so let's just do it. And so holly, ivy, and anything green ended up draped over altars, hung around houses, and woven into garlands that probably shed everywhere. Some traditions even suggested that greenery kept evil spirits away, which was a very medieval reason to do anything. The Yule log, a giant chunk of tree. Probably the most iconic medieval Christmas thing is the Yule log. And if you're imagining a cute fireplace-sized log, absolutely not. A medieval Yule log was supposed to be enormous, like this tree died for your holiday comfort enormous. Whole families or entire villages dragged this massive log into the house. It had to be big enough to burn for days, ideally 12 of them, because nothing says festive like watching a tree slowly die in your hearth while praying sparks don't jump onto your straw floor and send your entire house to heaven early. People decorated the log a bit, sprinkled some salt or wine on it, as one does, and then lit it ceremonially. And once it was burning, the goal was to keep it going, constantly. This was winter Netflix. Everyone just stared at the fire and talked quietly. Some families saved a piece of the log after Christmas because it was considered lucky, or protective, or just a very medieval version of, this is sentimental, nobody throw it out. Let's wander into the village festivities. Peasants, who made up about 90% of the population despite being treated like background characters in their own lives, celebrated Christmas in ways that were humble but still kind of fun. And by fun, I mean the medieval version of fun, which involved a lot of bread, ale, and watching animals behave badly. In most villages, Christmas was one of the few times peasants weren't expected to work fields, thresh grain, or do other tasks that technically counted as survival. Many lords even let peasants take several days off, a medieval miracle nearly equivalent to winning the lottery. So, peasants used the time to eat foods they normally couldn't afford, visit friends, play games involving sticks, stones, or occasionally live animals, drink ale until they forgot how cold it was, and yes, they went to church. A lot. Christmas meant multiple services over multiple days because medieval people treated church attendance like a competitive sport. What they actually ate. Let's talk food, because no medieval Christmas script is complete without pointing out how much meat the upper classes ate while peasants were out here making excitement noises over onions. If you were wealthy, Christmas was basically a dietary flex. You ate to show off. Food equals status, and medieval nobles lived for status, often because their personalities lacked any other defining features. A noble Christmas feast might include roasted boar, roast goose, roast basically anything that once walked. Pies stuffed with questionable combinations of animals, sugar sculptures, if you were very fancy, spiced wine, enough bread to build a small fort. And yes, they had a dish called mince pie that originally included real meat, because medieval Europe never encountered a food concept they didn't want to compromise with protein. Meanwhile, peasants ate bread, pottage, the eternal medieval soup that tasted like resignation, maybe some pork if the Lord was generous, the occasional treat like honey cakes. Still, Christmas meals were the best peasants would get all year, and they knew it. Even a scrap of roasted meat felt like a holiday miracle. Music, carols, and that one guy with the pipe. Because now we float deeper into medieval Christmas, which somehow manages to get both weirder and more endearing the longer you look at it. We talked about Advent, greenery, feasting, and that enormous Yule log that definitely violated at least 3 modern fire codes. Now let's drift into what the rest of the Christmas season looked like. Because medieval Europe didn't do one-day Christmas. Oh no, they did 12 days, minimum. Because of course they did. Medieval life was either exhausting or boring, with absolutely no in-between. So when they finally had a chance to celebrate something, they went all in. For nearly 2 weeks. Welcome to the post-Christmas stretch, filled with lords showing off, peasants trying to avoid getting yelled at, priests trying to keep order, and everyone collectively pretending they were warm. The 12 days of Christmas. A very long party. The Christmas season officially ran from December 25th to January 6th, ending with Epiphany. Or, if you were in a particularly festive region, you extended the party until Candlemas in February, because time was fake and nobody had calendars on their walls. During the 12 days of Christmas, people stopped pretending to be serious, holy, fasting individuals and fully embraced eating, drinking, visiting each other, slightly regrettable decisions, and a general confusion about what day it was. Think of it like the medieval version of the period between Christmas and New Year's, where time stops working. Except theirs lasted almost 2 weeks and involved significantly more livestock. And because medieval people absolutely loved hierarchy, everyone celebrated differently. So let's drift into the manorial hall first, the place where the money, the food, and the ego lived. Inside the Lord's Hall, where Christmas became a status Olympics. A medieval Lord's Christmas celebration was basically an annual display of wealth disguised as religious devotion. Lords weren't subtle. They celebrated Christmas like, look at all the stuff I have. Also, praise Jesus. The hall was decorated with greenery. Holly, ivy, maybe rosemary if the kitchen wasn't hoarding it. Big tapestries were hung up to block drafts, which did absolutely nothing but at least looked fancy. And at the center was the long table where the Lord sat in front of everyone like the main character he believed himself to be. A typical Lord's Christmas feast had several key features. 1. Food that made no sense. Medieval nobles did not eat simply. They ate dramatically. Dishes existed solely to make guests say, "Ah yes, that must have been expensive." You might find a fully roasted peacock with its feathers reattached for decoration. A boar's head painted with gold leaf for reasons no one has ever explained logically. Pies containing up to 5 different animals, because who needs boundaries? Spiced wine so strong it could knock out a mule. And sugar sculptures if the household had money and absolutely no joy. The goal wasn't taste. The goal was flexing. Endless music. Lords hired minstrels, pipers, drummers, and anyone who could make noise without frightening livestock. Music filled the hall constantly, usually drifting into repetitive melodies that were surprisingly soothing, especially if you were 5 cups of ale deep. There was always that one guy with a bagpipe who thought he was the star of the evening, and the lute player who looked 2 minutes away from falling asleep on his instrument. All very on-brand. The performance of generosity. Christmas required nobles to appear kind, not be kind, just appear so. So they gave out bread, leftover meat, coins, occasionally shoes, and sometimes, very begrudgingly, ale. Peasants would come into the hall, bow, receive whatever gift the Lord was pretending to be generous with, and leave quickly before he changed his mind. And while the Lord handed out gifts, he usually gave a speech about community and God's blessings, while probably thinking about how much he hated taxes. Nothing brings people together like performative generosity. Meanwhile, the peasants were having their own version of Christmas. Outside the hall, in cottages, village greens, and communal hearth spaces, peasants celebrated Christmas with fewer roasted peacocks and more, "We're thankful for warm socks." For peasants, Christmas meant more food than usual, more ale than usual, more gossip than usual, and way more singing than anyone requested. One of the most important traditions in many villages was wassailing. It involved going house to house, singing, and receiving food or drink in return. Sort of like caroling, but with more mild intoxication. Peasants also played games, which most involved hitting things, throwing things, or trying to avoid injuring each other while slipping on frozen mud. Popular activities included stool ball, a very early ancestor of cricket, snowball fights with ice-laced snowballs because compassion was optional, hurling things at targets, hurling things at each other, and dancing in circles until someone tripped. Basically, a village Christmas was chaotic, loud, and surprisingly joyful, even when everything was freezing. But we can't talk about medieval Christmas without acknowledging its most spectacular nonsense. Yes, I'm talking about the Feast of Fools. The Feast of Fools, medieval Europe's "let's all act up for a day" tradition. Some medieval regions held a festival known as the Feast of Fools during the Christmas season or on New Year's Day, where the normal religious and social order was temporarily turned upside down. This was the medieval equivalent of pressing the chaos button. Churches would elect a fake bishop or lord of misrule, let choir boys perform mock ceremonies, allow joking, singing, and dancing in the nave, and generally act like they'd all decided holiness could wait a day. People would wear masks, costumes, or animal ears for reasons nobody fully documented, probably because documentation wasn't very cool. While church authorities often hated the Feast of Fools, the festival persisted because medieval people desperately needed a break from the constant seriousness of life, especially during winter, which was basically seasonal depression with extra steps. And this is where we gently drift into something equally chaotic, but more structured: the Lord of Misrule. The Lord of Misrule, a professional agent of chaos. Throughout much of medieval and early Tudor England, the Lord of Misrule presided over Christmas celebrations, usually chosen from among the household servants or lower-ranking courtiers. This person's job description was make mischief, tell jokes, organize silly activities, encourage everyone to lighten up, and basically be the human version of a holiday gremlin. For one day, or several, this person was in charge, though in the same way a raccoon rifling through your garbage is in charge, meaning more symbolic than functional. The Lord of Misrule would lead dancing, mock tribunals, funny punishments like making nobles sing poorly written songs, inexplicably strange games, and feasts where rules were intentionally bent. But all of this was controlled chaos, acceptable for Christmas, but absolutely not tolerated any other time. A controlled release valve. Nothing more medieval than that. Gift giving. Again, but slightly more interesting. Even though major Christmas gift giving wasn't a widespread tradition, certain groups did exchange gifts. Nobles often exchanged tokens of favor, fine cloth, rings, small icons or religious items, or if they were feeling extra dramatic, hawks. Clergy received offerings from parishioners, which were supposed to be holy, but often looked suspiciously like bribes, especially if someone needed to confess something awkward. Children might receive nuts, apples, bread, occasionally a coin, almost never toys. Medieval parents weren't big on toys. If a kid wanted entertainment, they were expected to use sticks, imagination, or mild treason. Church services, round 2, the ongoing holiday marathon. While the Feast of Fools was happening in one corner of Europe, regular churches had their own schedule because Christmas wasn't just a day, it was a whole liturgical workout routine. There were masses, more masses, and follow-up masses, services for saints' days, and additional services because someone thought there weren't enough services. People spent an enormous amount of time in church during the 12 days of Christmas, enough to make even the pious mutter under their breath. But the atmosphere was beautiful in a sleepy, echoing way. Stone chambers filled with candlelight, soft chanting floating through the cold, incense drifting lazily upward, the sound of pages turning slowly as monks read from illuminated manuscripts. A gentle hush that made everything feel timeless. A medieval Christmas service wasn't exciting. It was soothing, slow, predictable, perfect for a world with few comforts. Twelfth Night, the grand, slightly confusing finale.
Take a breath, maybe readjust your pillow, and let your thoughts slow to that soft, late-night hum. Because in this part, we wade deeper into the strangely peaceful, slightly unpredictable waters of medieval Christmas, where piety, superstition, food scarcity, and mild social awkwardness blended into one long winter mood. We've wandered through the feasts, the devotions, the chaotic festivals, and the occasional goose wearing a decorative glaze. Now we're moving into the quieter corners, the parts of medieval Christmas people didn't always write down, but definitely lived through. This is the side of the holiday that happened between the big events, in the cold mornings, the dim church corners, the echoing monastic halls, and the tiny moments where people tried to make winter feel a little less awful. So let's float there. A slow morning in a medieval home. Picture a medieval Christmas morning. Not the noble hall, not the church, but the average peasant home. It's cold, unreasonably cold, the kind of cold where you feel betrayed by God and your blanket. You wake up before sunrise because medieval Europe didn't believe in sleeping in. The fire has gone out during the night because wood is expensive, and also the hearth is basically a hole in the wall pretending to be a heating device. The entire family, and in many homes that meant several people sharing a single room, start stirring. Medieval people didn't leap out of bed. They eased into the day, mostly because they physically couldn't leap without freezing solid. Someone pokes at the leftover embers, someone else wraps themselves in whatever they slept in, and everyone pretends they're used to this, even though no human being ever gets used to waking up in a room that's the same temperature as the outside air. Still, there's a Christmas feeling. A small, warm one. The knowledge that today is different. There might be a loaf of bread saved for today, maybe a bit of cheese. Perhaps the Lord handed out some meat last night and it's sitting proudly on the table like a celebrity appearance. And even though morning chores never take a holiday, they feel a little lighter on Christmas. Fewer demands, fewer expectations, a touch of joy, even if it's the quiet kind. So let's float there. Monastic Christmas, endless chants, and quiet good cheer. Now, let's gently glide over to a monastery, because monks and nuns were basically the professional Christians of medieval Europe, and Christmas was their Super Bowl. Except instead of cheering, they chanted. And instead of snacks, they had bread so bland it could put you into a meditative trance. Monastic life at Christmas wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful, very peaceful. Imagine stone corridors chilled by winter, long cloisters dimly lit with candles, the soft scratch of quills copying texts, the distant sound of a bell marking the hours, and the steady hum of voices chanting together like one long, extended exhale. During Christmas, monks and nuns kept their daily structure. Early prayers, meals eaten in silence, scripture reading, work, more prayers, and sleep in cold dormitories that technically counted as beds. But there were small comforts too. The food was a little better than usual. The liturgical music was more celebratory. The atmosphere was contemplative in a gentle, dreamy way. Medieval monasteries were not places of excitement, but if your idea of a good holiday is peace, quiet, and avoiding all social obligations, you would have thrived there. And yes, monks absolutely leaned into the season with everything they had: decorated altars, special chants, and solemn processions that probably felt long but soothing. A medieval Christmas service in a monastery was like stepping into a different reality, slow, echoing, timeless. The weather, the uninvited guest at every celebration. We don't talk about medieval weather enough, which is funny because medieval people talked about it constantly. Winter was harsh, sometimes violently so, and Christmas happened smack in the middle of the everyone hopes winter doesn't kill them this year season. The cold wasn't gentle. It was biting, relentless, a full-time job to avoid. And yet, people still celebrated. Snow piled against cottage walls, ice formed in church doorways, puddles froze into obstacles, and wind cut across fields like a personal insult. But the medieval mindset was something like, well, everything is terrible. Might as well sing about it. This is partly why the warmth of Christmas mattered so much. A fire that burned all night felt miraculous. A hot meal felt like a luxury. A candle's glow was comforting in a world where darkness lasted about 18 hours a day. And sure, medieval people complained. A lot. They absolutely wrote down things like, "This winter is the worst winter ever," nearly every year. But they also created traditions that turned the season into something more than just a cold endurance test. Christmas became a coping mechanism, a communal sigh of relief, a chance to forget winter for a moment. Animals and Christmas. Yes, even they joined in. Medieval people were absolutely convinced that animals behaved differently on Christmas Eve. This was not a minor belief. It was widespread and persistent. Some thought animals bowed at midnight. Oxen kneeled in their stalls. Horses whinnied prayers, and bees hummed hymns in their hives. This is adorable, but also very medieval, because the Middle Ages were full of charming superstition wrapped in religious conviction. There was a general belief that on Christmas Eve, the natural and supernatural worlds overlapped just a little. Animals sensed it, the environment sensed it, people sensed it. Were these things true? No. Did it make people feel closer to the holiday? Absolutely. Even if the animals were just, well, standing there, being animals. Probably wondering why their owners were staring at them in the dark, waiting for something dramatic to happen. Still, it was comforting. And it gave the night a quiet magic. The kitchen, the heart of medieval Christmas. If you want to understand medieval Christmas properly, you have to spend time in the kitchen. Picture a huge, smoky stone room, a fire roaring,
pots hanging over flames, steam everywhere, and a small army of servants, cooks, and assistants working like their lives depend on it, which they kind of did. Christmas cooking was a monumental task. Kitchens produced roasts, pastries, bread, pottages, sauces, ale, sweetmeats, and anything else considered special. Cooks were the unsung heroes of medieval Christmas. They worked non-stop, usually starting days before the feast. To keep food warm, they used brick ovens, hearths, heavy lids, and piles of embers. To flavor food, they relied on herbs, honey, vinegar, mustard, and spices like cinnamon, ginger, and clove if the Lord had money. To taste test, they often just guessed. Food safety was not a medieval priority. If it smelled fine, it was fine. If it didn't smell fine, they added more spices until it did. And yes, and yet, despite all this, the Christmas meal was the highlight of the season. Hot food in winter was happiness. Flavor in winter was luxury. Feasting together was cherished. Even peasants who couldn't afford much found joy in eating something warm, fresh, and seasoned. The kitchen didn't just feed the stomach, it fed morale. Christmas as a social reset button. Here's a fun thing. Medieval Christmas wasn't just a holiday. It was a temporary suspension of reality. For a few days, the strict social hierarchy loosened. Just slightly. Don't get excited. No revolutions here. Just gentler vibes. But it was enough. Lords pretended to be generous. Peasants pretended to be cheerful and non-exhausted. Clergy pretended not to judge the feasting too harshly. Servants pretended they weren't about to drop from exhaustion. Most importantly, people interacted more. They visited, they talked, they shared news, stories, gossip, and laughter. Christmas was one of the few times medieval people could count on humanity feeling softer. Even in noble households, where hierarchy was suffocating, Christmas softened some edges. Servants received gifts, lower-ranking men dined in the hall, music filled the air, and the Lord smiled more, or at least tried. It wasn't equality, not even close, but it was something. A gentle reminder that everyone in the... If you're still awake after the last few sections of medieval winter melancholy, congratulations. And if you're not, well, honestly, that means I'm doing my job correctly. So, let's continue floating through the candlelit, drafty hallways of medieval Europe, where Christmas was equal parts holy devotion, mild chaos, and people aggressively pretending that salted pork counted as a treat. Just settle in, slow your breathing, and let's glide deeper into the dimly lit customs of the season. Sliding into medieval seasonal music, aka Please Stop Singing That One Hymn. By now, you might expect that medieval Christmas music was majestic, harmonic, and deeply inspiring. And sure, sometimes. But also, let's remember that most people didn't exactly have access to a fully tuned organ or a choir with consistent pitch. The average Christmas song between the 12th and 15th centuries involved people who sang, once a year, standing in a cold nave, trying very hard not to cough through the Latin verses they only half knew. Because the thing about Latin, almost no one outside the clergy understood it. But that didn't stop anyone from chanting it loudly and with great confidence, like someone aggressively mumbling karaoke lyrics. What you'd hear most often, long, droning chants, repetitive refrains, and the occasional attempt at harmony, which usually lasted about 3 seconds before collapsing into unintentional dissonance. But that's the charm. It was soothing, monotonous, and just hypnotic enough to make you forget that your toes were numb. And then you had the instruments. Medieval Christmas instruments were essentially the recorder, which still sounds like a medieval goose, the hurdy-gurdy, like a violin that's been turned into a drone machine, the rebec, tiny medieval violin that always sounds slightly anxious, hand drums, because beating something rhythmically has always been fun, bagpipes, because, of course, bagpipes. Imagine bagpipes echoing inside a stone church. Yes, it was exactly as piercing as you think. But this wasn't a performance culture. It was a communal thing. Even a slightly out-of-tune parish choir could turn Christmas Mass into something deeply atmospheric. The mix of flickering candles, cold air, and sleepy chanting basically created the medieval version of a lo-fi playlist. So, in a way, every village choir was just trying to curate the perfect calming ambiance. Very on brand for this channel, honestly. Let's drift toward medieval Christmas decorations, or lack thereof. So, here's the thing. Medieval people really did not decorate the way we decorate. There were no strings of lights, no shiny glass balls, definitely no inflatable Santa stuck in a chimney. They did, however, love evergreens. Evergreen branches symbolized life in the midst of winter, which felt reassuring when everything else was dull, gray, and resembling a nature documentary titled Things That Are Currently Dead or Asleep. So households, especially wealthier ones, might scatter around sprigs of holly, branches of ivy, bits of fir or pine, maybe bay leaves if you were fancy. And since holly had bright red berries, it became the medieval version of adding a pop of color. But don't picture neatly arranged wreaths. Medieval decor was more casual, as in, let's shove these branches here and hope they make the place feel less depressing. A noble household might go a little further. They could hang garlands along the hall or weave evergreens into the rafters, but again, subtle. No maximalist Hallmark holiday explosion happening. Just a gentle nod to the theme of life continues somehow. One thing you didn't see: Christmas trees. Those came later, much later. So medieval folks would be very confused if they saw you dragging a full tree into your living room and covering it with breakable ornaments while your cat plotted its destruction. Drifting over to pageants, plays, and other slow-moving entertainment. If you lived in a decent-sized town, you might encounter a Christmas pageant. And these weren't cute little school plays. They were community performances involving almost everyone who didn't successfully sneak out the back door. Most plays were religious stories, Bible scenes, saint tales, moral parables, but they were performed by, how do we put this gently, people who were not professional actors. You'd have a shepherd who forgot his lines, an angel whose wings kept shedding feathers, a king wearing a robe that's clearly just someone's curtain. A stage setup built from whatever lumber wasn't already being used to repair carts. And honestly, yes, it was adorable. The plays could last hours. People would stand, huddle, and occasionally stamp their feet to stay warm. The pacing was slow, the delivery was slower, and yet it all had the cozy charm of a community trying its best. And nobles had fancier entertainment. They hired minstrels, troubadours, and jesters, each with varying levels of talent and sobriety. A minstrel might perform poetry. A troubadour might sing a courtly love song that made no sense because he'd forgotten the rhyme scheme halfway through. A jester might juggle apples and drop at least one. It was all very gentle, very drawn out, and exactly the kind of entertainment that lulls you into sleep if you're not maintaining eye contact with a candle. Let's drift even further toward feasting customs you definitely don't want to recreate. We talked earlier about feasting, but let's expand on how those meals actually worked. Because medieval banquet etiquette was essentially a survival sport. Picture this. You're sitting at a long table, shoulder to shoulder with people you may or may not like, while dishes keep arriving. But you don't have your own plate. Not really. What you have is a trencher, a stale piece of bread used as a plate. You'd place your food on it. It absorbed sauces. It grew soggy. And eventually, if you were fancy, a servant might take it away and give you a clean one. If you weren't fancy, you either ate it or gave it to the poor afterward. So, yes, medieval charity sometimes involved handing out unwanted bread plates soaked in meat juice. Forks weren't common yet, so everyone was using knives and fingers, which meant the communal tablecloth was basically one big shared napkin. At the end of the meal, it looked exactly how you think it did. Feasts involved a parade of dishes brought out in courses, but not the neat appetizer, entree, dessert structure we use today. A course was more like, here are 8 meats and a pie. Also a fish. Also this strange thing that may or may not be edible. Here's a custard. No, we don't have a logical reason why the custard is here. And this continued until the hosts ran out of food or enthusiasm. Everything was slow, steady, and comforting in that I'm now too full to hold my own head up way. Gently floating into the world of gifts and giving. Medieval gift-giving wasn't what we think of today. There were no toys, no personal gadgets, definitely no wrapping paper printed with cartoon snowmen. Instead, gifts tended to be practical or symbolic. You might receive gloves, a belt, a small knife, a book if you were fancy, fabric, a devotional object, a coin, fruit, which genuinely counted as a treat. If you were a lord or lady, your holiday gifts were really more like feudal obligations with bows. You'd give out small presents to tenants or servants, tokens of goodwill that also reminded them who the boss was. Kings gave lavish gifts to nobles, because nothing says, please don't revolt this year, than a shiny object. But gift-giving was not universal. In many places, Christmas wasn't the gift holiday. New Year's Day was. So, depending on where you lived, Christmas came without the pressure of shopping, wrapping, or pretending to like something you definitely won't use. Honestly, medieval people had it easier in this specific category. Now, let's float into a very cozy corner, the Christmas hearth. Imagine a medieval home. The cold air seeps through every crack because insulation hasn't been invented yet. The windows are covered in oilcloth or horn instead of glass, and the only thing standing between you and frostbite is the hearth. Christmas gatherings often centered around that one source of warmth. Families would sit near the fire, slowly thawing, quietly chatting, and trying not to. If you're still with me, eyes half open, brain pleasantly foggy, then you've reached that perfect cozy stage where medieval history starts to feel like a warm, familiar blanket woven from candle smoke and questionable hygiene. So let's continue floating through the long winter nights of medieval Europe, where Christmas was holy, hearty, occasionally awkward, and always happening in a room that could desperately use insulation. Settle in, breathe, and let's wander deeper into the slow, meandering traditions of the season. Let's drift into medieval charity, the soft, sleepy heart of the season. Now, medieval people didn't have our modern concept of social services. There were no government programs, no holiday fundraisers, no organized donation drives. There was just the church,
and the expectation that if you had any extra food, you should probably share it so God wouldn't think you were a jerk. Christmas was one of the biggest charity days of the year. The logic went something like, Christ wants you to be generous, it's winter, people are hungry, so please give someone something before the frost finishes the job. Charity took many forms: distributing bread to the poor, handing out leftover feast food, giving small coins or tokens, offering warm drinks, letting people come inside the hall or church for warmth, gifting old clothing that you definitely weren't wearing anymore anyway. It wasn't glamorous, but it was sincere. A noble handing out gifts at Christmas wasn't just being kind. They were reinforcing their social image, showing off their status, and reminding everyone they weren't completely heartless. And honestly, peasants appreciated it. A loaf of bread, a slice of roast meat, a warm cloak, these things could mean surviving January. Medieval charity wasn't dramatic. It was slow, simple, and necessary. Imagine a line of villagers waiting near the manor, wrapped in wool cloaks, snow gently falling, each person stepping forward to receive a congealed but very appreciated ladle of stew. It's all very mild, very quiet, very much a now I can actually get through the week energy. Let's drift into church services, long, cold, and perfect for falling asleep standing up. Listen, if you think modern holiday church services are long, medieval people would like to offer you a solid wooden pew to faint onto. Because Christmas meant multiple services, and they could be hours long, and they were in stone buildings. Stone buildings that held on to cold like it was their life purpose. Most people stood through the entire thing, bundled in every layer they owned, listening to Latin chants, readings of scripture, sermons about humility, more chants, more readings, yet another sermon, and a surprising amount of incense. There were 3 main masses on Christmas Day: Midnight Mass, the dramatic one, Dawn Mass, the sleepy one, and Day Mass, the "Are we still doing this?" one. If all 3 sound like a lot, yes, they were. But for many medieval people, Christmas was the most spiritually comforting time of year. The darkness outside, the glow of candles inside, it all felt otherworldly. And those candles were important because they were basically the heating system. People would lean toward them ever so slightly, trying to soak up any tiny bit of warmth during the long, echoing hymns. Picture a sea of vagers in winter cloaks shifting their weight, nodding slowly as the priest recited another passage. Some dozed off, quietly, respectfully, because nobody can stay fully awake in a building that cold at midnight, listening to a chant that sounds like the world's slowest lullaby. Church was holy, but also surprisingly soothing. And now let's slowly drift into medieval household gatherings. After the religious duties came the cozy part, gathering at home. Homes were small, dark, warm only near the fire. But on Christmas Day, that room felt alive. A pot bubbling on the hearth, bread laid out on the table, people huddled together because warmth is communal. Children sat on the floor. Grandparents sat closest to the fire because they had seniority in both age and warmth rights. And parents quietly exhaled the holiday stress like modern adults do after attending too many seasonal events. And storytelling was a big thing. Not exciting stories, more like slow, familiar tales everyone had heard 10 times. Saint legends, old family stories,
regional folklore, maybe a dramatic retelling of the time the cow got loose and ruined last year's barn decorations. All delivered in slow, rhythmic voices while the fire crackled. It was the medieval version of watching your favorite comforting movie for the 100th time. Let's float into an uncomfortable truth. Medieval Christmas had zero privacy. If you're imagining a quiet nuclear family Christmas, no. Privacy was a luxury medieval people absolutely did not possess. Rooms were shared, beds were shared, sometimes even blankets were shared. And during Christmas, homes were especially full. Extended family might visit. Servants moved around preparing meals. Neighbors dropped in because visiting was a thing people just did without warning. So your quiet Christmas afternoon might involve a cousin sleeping on your floor, an uncle loudly snoring near the fire, a neighbor borrowing your only cooking pot, livestock bleating from the corner of the same room you're eating in. And nobody found this weird. This was normal Christmas energy. Life was communal. Noise was constant. Conversations blended together like a medieval white noise generator. It wasn't peaceful in our modern sense, but it was deeply human. Warm bodies, shared food, one fire, one room, one moment of the year when everyone slowed down together. Let's drift over to hospitality and visiting customs. Visiting was a big part of medieval Christmas. People expected you to visit relatives, neighbors, old friends, and sometimes even rivals because the holiday truce energy demanded politeness. You couldn't just stay home and avoid people. That would be rude and suspicious. And medieval society thrived on gossip, so you really didn't want that. Visits were simple. You arrived unannounced. You said hello. You were offered food, even if the host had none to spare. And you returned the favor later in the season. This endless loop of stop by, eat bread, leave was basically the social glue of the holiday. For nobles, hospitality was on another level. Guests expected seating, entertainment, warm drinks, food, and not being frozen half to death. Nobles knew that failing to host properly meant losing respect, so they poured effort into making their halls warm-ish, bright-ish, and full of music that was probably off-key, but still charming. It was less about joy, more about duty softened by tradition. Floating back toward food, the quiet aftermath of the feast. Earlier we talked about the feasting, big, loud, chaotic, but afterward came the quiet lull. The post-feast fade-out. People leaned back, talked softly, played small games, or simply stared into nothing with a food-induced calm that transcended time and space. There were traditional games, dice, board games, counting riddles, nothing too wild. Christmas wasn't a party holiday yet. It was a slow one. And let's not forget that food was precious. So after the feast, families carefully stored whatever they could. Leftovers were intentional. They helped the household get through the rest of winter. Nothing was wasted, not even the bones, which became broth. Not even the stale bread, which became tomorrow's trencher. Not even the grease, which could be used for lamps. Medieval frugality was impressive and slightly exhausting, but very efficient. Let's drift into Christmas markets, slow, cold, and wholesome. In some towns, you might find a small Christmas market. Nothing huge, just a few stalls offering things like honey cakes, nuts, candles, spices, Small toys carved from wood.
So let's continue gliding softly through the long candlelit winter and into a part of medieval Christmas that people today often forget existed. The sleepy chaos, mild misrule, and gentle upside-downness of the season. It won't be exciting, it won't be dramatic, but it will be strange. In that cozy, medieval people really made this up and everyone just went along with it kind of way. Settle in, loosen your shoulders, and let's drift. Let's float into the Lord of Misrule, medieval Christmas's most polite chaos. So here's something delightful. Some medieval households, especially in England and Scotland, appointed a Lord of Misrule during the Christmas season. But don't imagine anything wild. This wasn't some rebellious figure taking over the kingdom. It was more like, let's give someone a silly title and permission to lightly annoy everyone for a few days. This lord could be a servant, a young person, or a lower-ranking member of the household. And their job was to invert social norms in the mildest way possible. Their duties included making harmless jokes, organizing games, encouraging singing, telling people to switch seats, supervising little pranks, deciding the order in which food was served, generally making things slightly sillier than normal. Basically, they were the medieval version of that one cousin who insists everyone play board games but says it politely. And everyone accepted this temporary power shift because it was symbolic. The idea that for a moment the world turned gently upside down. Not wildly, not dangerously, just enough to make people chuckle quietly before returning to their normal hierarchy once the holiday ended. Nobles enjoyed this because it entertained their household. Servants enjoyed it because it gave them a rare chance to see their lord obeying harmless commands like sing a verse or sit over there. It was all soft mischief. Very sleepy, very controlled, and very medieval. Let's drift into wassailing, medieval people's favorite low-energy party. Wassailing was one of the most iconic winter traditions. Part caroling, part drinking ritual, part friendly begging, part community bonding. Picture this: a group of villagers wandering from house to house or orchard to orchard, holding cups of warm spiced ale and singing songs that were less musical excellence and more drunken chanting in unison. But no one expected skill. Wassailing was about togetherness. There were two flavors of it. 1. House-to-house wassailing. This was basically medieval reverse trick-or-treating. People showed up at your door, they sang, you were expected to give them food or drink. Everyone exchanged blessings, and the night continued, slowly and warmly. It wasn't loud, it wasn't rowdy. Mostly, it was neighbors being neighborly, wrapped in cloaks, faces red from cold wind and warm ale. 2. Orchard wassailing. This was more pagan-flavored. In some parts of England, people would sing to apple trees. Yes, actual trees, to encourage good harvests next year. Imagine a group of adults and children standing in an orchard on a frosty night, chanting things like, "Grow strong, bear fruit," all while someone gently poured cider on the roots. It sounds surreal now, but it was soothing and symbolic, a way of reassuring themselves that winter wouldn't last forever. Let's gently glide into medieval time perception. Christmas wasn't one day. Medieval people thought of Christmas as a season. A long one. 12 days to be exact. Yes, the original 12 Days of Christmas wasn't just a song. It was an actual thing. Christmas started on December 25th and stretched to January 6th, which was Epiphany. Imagine nearly 2 weeks of lighter workloads, communal meals, slow gatherings,
gentle rituals, and a general, "we're still not going back to normal yet" ambiance. People weren't feasting the entire time, not unless they were wealthy and their pantry could handle it. But every day felt a little special. Some days had particular traditions. Some were quiet. Some involved small saints' feast days, but all flowed together in a soft, unhurried rhythm. For many medieval folks, this was the quietest, least exhausting time of year, a long exhale after the harvest season. Imagine waking up on December 30th and thinking, "Oh right, Christmas is still happening," and then going about your day very gently. Let's drift into the Feast of Fools, when cleric got silly slowly. Now this one sounds dramatic, but wasn't. The Feast of Fools was a clerical festival that allowed minor clerics to parody their superiors. But again, this was medieval parody, not sharp satire, not rebellion. More like wearing mismatched vestments, singing chants backwards, lightly teasing the bishop, holding mock processions, gently poking fun at church hierarchy. It was all harmless amusement. Most of it was harmless amusement. Some bishops tolerated it, some outlawed it. Most communities practiced it gently on the down low. It never turned into chaos, just mild silliness wrapped in incense and candlelight. Let's float back into the eternal darkness, winter nights as the backdrop. One thing that made medieval Christmas feel especially dreamlike was the darkness. During the medieval winter, the sun set early, the nights were long. Most activity happened by candle or firelight. And because medieval streets weren't lit, nighttime wandering was rare, unless it was part of a ritual or festival. So much of Christmas happened in dim glow. Ancient church interiors with golden flickers, manor halls warmed by hearths, small cottages lit by a single tallow candle, night markets illuminated by lanterns, wassailers carrying torches. It all had that soft, sleepy ambiance, a world wrapped in shadow and flame. Christmas wasn't bright. It was dim, intimate, and atmospheric, perfect for slow storytelling and gentle rituals. Let's drift into medieval money traditions, gifts, rents, and obligations. Now, unlike modern holiday bonuses, medieval Christmas had its own version of financial customs. Many peasants paid their yearly rents in late December or early January. This wasn't a joyous event, but it was tradition. On the flip side, lords sometimes gave small amounts of money, food, or goods to their tenants. Not enough to change their lives, just enough to feel like holiday generosity. For artisans, Christmas was peak tip your local medieval worker season. People would give small coins, leftover feast scraps, warm drinks, gifts of candles or cloth. It created a quiet cycle of giving that kept communities connected. Let's drift into the animals' Christmas, a very medieval kind of compassion. Medieval people were deeply attuned to their livestock. Without animals, you starved. So Christmas came with specific expectations around caring for them. It was customary to give animals extra feed, warmer bedding, kind words, yes, really, and a bit more attention than usual. There were legends that animals spoke at midnight on Christmas Eve, but listening was considered bad luck. You weren't supposed to eavesdrop on a cow's personal midnight sermon. People liked the idea that animals shared in the holy peace of the night, so they treated them gently. Soft touches, warm stalls, a sense of we're all trying to survive this winter together. It's very wholesome and very medieval. Let's drift into quiet domestic tasks of the season. Christmas wasn't all ritual and feasting. A lot of it was just chores, but slower, more symbolic.
People spent the season mending clothes, repairing tools, spinning wool, baking more slowly than usual, making candles, preparing preserved foods, cleaning, sort of, burning sweet herbs for scent. These tasks weren't dramatic. They were rhythmic, calming, and deeply everyday. Imagine a noblewoman sitting by the fire, embroidery hoop in hand, or a peasant woman kneading dough while snow drifts lazily outside. Christmas was work, but quiet work. Work done in a house full of voices, warmth, and low light. Let's drift into Yule customs that survived Christianization. Some older, pre-Christian elements blended seamlessly into medieval Christmas. None of them were dramatic. Most were quiet survivals.
We're floating now into the post-Christmas haze of the 12 days. You might already know the phrase, but in medieval Europe, this wasn't just a cute carol about increasingly impractical gifts. The 12 days of Christmas were a real thing. And honestly, they functioned like one long cool-down period after the explosive chaos of December 25th. Imagine Christmas Day as the medieval equivalent of putting your foot all the way down on the gas pedal, and then the following 12 days were just gently gliding until the momentum naturally died off. Except, because this is medieval Europe, nothing was ever that gentle. These days spanned all the way to Epiphany on January 6th, and because people firmly believed that the spiritual world was basically thinner during this time, they also believed that unfortunate supernatural weirdness could slip in unless you behaved yourself. So, naturally, they behaved themselves by drinking more ale and placing random herbs over doorways. Because that's exactly what you do when spirits are allegedly roaming around. You get tipsy and hope rosemary solves it. Let's drift into one of the major events of this stretch, the Feast of the Holy Innocents on December 28th. If you're thinking that name sounds a little too depressing for a festive season, you would be correct. The day commemorated the biblical massacre of infants, which is so unbelievably bleak it could put a medieval mystic into an existential timeout. But for reasons known only to the Middle Ages, this somber day somehow morphed into a children's festival? In several regions, kids were put in charge of the household or the cathedral for the day. Even better, sometimes a child bishop was elected. Yes, they literally picked one child, slapped bishop robes on him, gave him a staff he was barely tall enough to hold upright, and let him lead processions and services. Relax. He wasn't allowed to consecrate anything, but he was absolutely allowed to give out blessings, which must have been adorable and mildly concerning in equal measure. Imagine being a weary medieval adult stumbling into church after your 18th consecutive feast, and the officiant is an 8-year-old who's trying to look solemn but is also obviously chewing on a dried fig he stashed in his sleeve. The Middle Ages were a time. From here, let's float softly into the next event. St. Thomas's Day, St. Stephen's Day, St. Sylvester's Day, and several other saint-themed markers scattered through late December and early January like a religious advent calendar with no off switch. Each came with its own traditions, usually involving food, blessings, tokens, or charitable giving. Not exciting, just steady, rhythmic, and entirely predictable. Perfect sleepy material. Speaking of tradition, no medieval Christmas season would be complete without a little harmless rule-breaking disguised as piety. People loved performing the boy bishop ritual, staging misrule, and occasionally doing things like swapping roles between servants and masters. If you're getting flashbacks to Saturnalia,
Congratulations, you've unlocked a historical theme park badge. Medieval Europe basically took Roman customs, dialed them down by 60%, sprinkled them with Christian symbolism, and called it a day. And honestly, it worked for them. Now let's drift toward the quieter side of things, because not every medieval Christmas was non-stop feasting and chaotic choir boys dressed like bishops. Plenty of folks, especially peasants, spent these days doing what they always did, tending to animals, repairing tools, and trying to keep their toes from freezing off in January wind. Their celebrations were small, often limited to whatever the lord of the manor decided to distribute. Maybe a loaf of bread, maybe some leftover meat, maybe a few logs of wood. Generous by medieval standards, bare minimum by ours. Still, they found ways to make it special. They told stories by the fire, passed down through generations, full of saints, miracles, and the occasional demon with a suspiciously bureaucratic personality. They played simple games, they sang songs that probably had 12 verses too many, and when nothing else was happening, they sat in the dark and listened to wind whistling through poorly insulated walls. It's strangely soothing to imagine, in a humble way. Let's stay in this quiet scene for a moment. A small timber cottage, a hearth that smokes just a little too much, a family huddled around the embers, occasional sparks floating up and disappearing. Outside, a landscape that's still, frost-covered, half asleep. No rush, no noise, no frantic post-holiday sales, just the slow passage of winter nights. But of course, the nobility couldn't possibly restrain themselves to such minimalism, not when there were reputations to uphold. The upper classes, meanwhile, were deep into the season of gift-giving. Medieval gifts were not like modern gifts. No cute wrapping paper or secret Santa games. These were practical objects or status symbols. Clothing, belts, hunting knives, bits of jewelry, occasional pursefuls of coins. Sometimes fruit. Yes, fruit. Don't underestimate how exciting imported citrus could be in a cold climate. And speaking of gifts, this is also the time when many nobles gave alms to the poor, which sounds nice until you realize it was often done publicly, in full view of the entire estate, so that everyone could admire how generous they were. The Middle Ages, where charity was sometimes performative at best. Now let's drift toward New Year's Day, which was honestly more important than Christmas in many regions. People exchanged gifts, made symbolic gestures of luck, and occasionally engaged in rituals that modern historians have to phrase delicately, because we still don't fully understand what was going on. But the general vibe was, it's January 1st, let's make sure the year doesn't fall apart immediately. It usually fell apart anyway, but the intention was there. By the time Epiphany approached, people were what the modern world would call done. The lords were tired of entertaining, the servants were tired of running around, the clergy were tired of officiating 3.5 million services, and the peasants, well, they were always tired. Epiphany on January 6th marked the end. Sort of. Some regions extended it further. Some stretched festivities into mid-January. Some, for reasons unknown, just kept going. But most recognized Epiphany as the day everything gently drifted back to normal. Another feast, another slow meal, another reminder that winter still had months to go. One of the sweetest traditions here was the sharing of the 12th night cake, a precursor to many modern king cakes. Hidden inside was a bean or small token. Whoever found it was crowned the king or queen of the feast. Sometimes this meant lighthearted silliness. Sometimes this meant actually giving minor commands for the evening. Nothing dramatic, no real power, just symbolic, cozy, harmless fun. Unless a real noble got the bean, then everyone had to pretend it wasn't awkward. And with that, the medieval Christmas season faded out. Slowly, quietly, like someone extinguishing a candle that had been burning for nearly 2 weeks straight. Nothing abrupt, just a soft return to routine. But before we end this section, let's drift through one last tradition. The belief that animals could speak on Christmas Eve. People didn't actually go out and try to make their cows recite poetry, but they definitely believed that something mystical was happening in the barns at midnight. And honestly, that kind of gentle superstition feels comforting in its own simple, rural way. It wasn't scary, it wasn't dramatic, just the idea that the world turned a little magical for a moment. And that's the heart of medieval Christmas. Simple people in complicated times trying to make winter feel a little warmer. Now, before you start imagining dazzling spreads like a modern holiday dinner, let's remember that medieval cuisine was functional. Cozy, but functional. And Christmas was one of the very few times when most people, from the humblest peasants to the most aggressively wealthy dukes, could count on eating something that wasn't beige. So let's settle in, breathe, and drift slowly through what it was actually like to eat during Christmas in medieval Europe. We'll start with the centerpiece of many medieval feasts, the roasted boar's head. Yes, the head, not the boar, not the leg, not the impressive meaty parts you'd think of first. They wanted the head. Why? Because it was symbolic, prestigious, and more importantly, just complicated enough to make your dinner guests go, "Oh wow, you really put effort into this." Boar's head was often decorated with herbs, fruits, maybe even an apple politely shoved in the mouth for extra flair. It was paraded into the hall almost like a celebrity cameo, accompanied by singing servants who are under strict orders not to drop it. If you've ever wondered what medieval glamour looked like, it was this, a pig head on a platter. Times were different. But that wasn't the only thing they roasted. If it moved, medieval nobles probably tried to serve it for Christmas. Venison? Absolutely. Geese? A classic. Chickens? A bit too common, but sure. Peacocks? Yes, they went all in on peacocks. And here's the fun detail. Sometimes, after roasting the peacock, they would carefully reattach its feathers so that it looked alive and magnificent, but also mysteriously cooked. Medieval people were extremely committed to presentation. Let's drift gently toward the next major holiday dish, mincemeat pies. Although medieval versions were not the sweet, spiced treats we think of now. These had actual minced meat inside. Beef, mutton, whatever was available, mixed with dried fruit, spices, and a somewhat alarming amount of fat. These pies were designed to stick to your ribs and convince your body it wasn't freezing outside, which it probably was. Now, while we're gliding through these dishes, let's talk about something that medieval people simply adored during Christmas. Spices. Not because the food was bland without them, though, honestly, sometimes it was, but because spices were a status symbol.
cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, saffron. If a noble could cram all of those into one dish, they absolutely would. It wasn't about taste, it was about social flexing. Picture a lord generously spooning saffron into a stew while a servant silently calculates that its cost equaled 3 months of their wages. Festive, in its own medieval way. Meanwhile, peasants were celebrating with food that was a little more grounded. Maybe a piece of pork if they were lucky. Maybe some bread made with whiter flour than usual. Maybe cheese or butter they'd been saving for the holiday. Nothing extravagant, nothing feathered and reassembled to look alive. Just simple food for a simple winter night. But even the lower classes had one beloved Christmas staple, pottage, which is essentially medieval soup. Think grains, vegetables, maybe a scrap of meat, slowly simmered into something warm and filling, comforting, mildly mushy, perfect sleepy narration material. Next, let's wander, slow, soft steps, into the world of medieval sweets. Because yes, even centuries before refined sugar was cheap, people still craved something vaguely dessert-like. They made sweetened pastries with honey. They created spiced cakes that were dense enough to double as paperweights. They had fritters, little fried treats dusted with whatever sweetener they could find. And sometimes, when feeling especially luxurious, they made marchpane, an early form of marzipan. This was reserved for the wealthiest tables because almonds were imported and sugar was practically the medieval cryptocurrency of choice. Imagine biting into marzipan at a medieval feast. You'd immediately know you were sitting with people who never worried about where their next meal was coming from. It was a flex disguised as dessert. Now, let's take a slow glide into the world of medieval beverages. The Middle Ages were not big on clean water. So at Christmas, like every other time of year, people leaned heavily on ale, wine, and that beloved warm drink of the season, wassail. Wassail was part beverage, part ritual. A warm, spiced concoction of ale or cider mixed with honey or sugar, sometimes topped with floating bits of toast. Yes, toast, just drifting in your drink like tiny edible rafts. People carried around bowls of wassail, toasted to one another's health, and, depending on region, sang songs to orchards in hopes of encouraging a better crop. Nothing says festive cheer than tipsily shouting good wishes at a tree. And let's not forget the noble habit of serving wine that had been mulled with spices. Medieval mulled wine was strong, very strong. As in, you will sleep through the entire week between Christmas and New Year strong. Perfect for a season when time was already becoming a blur. Now, while the nobles were feasting, the servants were also feasting. Surprisingly, Christmas was one of the few times when higher status households gave their servants an actual break and actual food. Not equal food, of course. This was medieval Europe, not a utopia. But better food than usual. You might get meat, maybe some wine, maybe even a leftover dessert if the Lord was feeling indulgent. Nothing brings people together like the annual moment when nobles realize servants are more likely to stick around if occasionally fed. Let's drift gently into the last big topic in medieval Christmas dining: symbolism.
Food wasn't just food. It carried meaning. Pork symbolized abundance. Spices symbolized wealth. Cakes symbolized celebration. Warm drinks symbolized hospitality. And everything symbolized the triumph of surviving another year. Because medieval winters were not kind. They were long, harsh, unpredictable. And Christmas wasn't just a holiday. It was an emotional checkpoint, a reassurance that the darkest nights of the year were passing. So when they loaded their tables, or when peasants shared their saved-up scraps, it meant more than indulgence. It meant endurance. And with that, let's float forward to another aspect of medieval Christmas. The sounds, the music, the carols, the chants that filled quiet stone churches and drafty timber halls alike. It's time to drift into the soundtrack of the season.
So take a slow breath, settle in, and float with me into the calm, echoing realm of medieval Christmas music. We begin, of course, in the church. Most of the population heard music primarily in religious settings, and Christmas was prime time for that. The main soundtrack was Gregorian chant, which is already basically spa music for monks. Smooth, monotone, peacefully predictable, perfect for falling asleep, whether or not you were supposed to be. Christmas chants followed the same formula, but with a slightly brighter tone. Not pop song cheerful, but monk who has had a second cup of wine cheerful. Warm, steady, and softly uplifting. Listening to these chants in a medieval stone church with candles flickering and cold air drifting through cracks would have been surprisingly cozy in that austere, monastic, we own 2 chairs total kind of way. Let's drift now to something more secular. Carols. Medieval carols weren't originally tied to Christmas. They were dance songs. Yes, dance songs, which feels slightly chaotic when you imagine monks humming solemnly in the background while villagers are doing little circular dances nearby. But over time, these songs were adopted into the festive season, rewritten with Christian themes, and eventually became holiday staples. But they still kept that dance-like rhythm. So imagine your modern Christmas playlist, but with a medieval peasant beat. Lots of repetition, lots of refrains, lyrics that ranged from "Praise be to Christ" to "Please enjoy this weirdly specific story about a saint." And because literacy rates were low, most songs were easy to remember. Simple patterns, short verses, enough repetition that you could sing along after drinking wassail that had more alcohol than structural integrity. Let's drift over now to the instruments. Medieval Europe loved instruments, but not necessarily beautiful instruments. No, they were very fond of anything that made a noise. Any noise. Bonus points if the noise was slightly alarming. The bagpipes, for instance. Yes, people played bagpipes at Christmas. Nothing says festive cheer than an instrument that sounds like a goat complaining about taxes. Then there were shawms, the medieval ancestors of oboes. These produced a piercing nasal sound that could be heard from a ridiculous distance. Imagine a clarinet and a foghorn having a child. That was a shawm. Nobles hired musicians to play them at feasts, possibly because subtlety was not a medieval value. Next we have the rebec, a bowed string instrument that looked like a violin that experienced mild misfortune. Its sound was thin, wobbly, and instantly recognizable, kind of like someone trying their best but not fully succeeding, which is extremely on brand for medieval aesthetics. There were also drums. Simple, steady, heartbeat-like drums, perfect for processions, dances, and anything that required a touch of pomp without too much enthusiasm. And of course, bells. Churches loved bells. Towns loved bells. Christmas loved bells. They rang to announce services. They rang to mark holy days. Sometimes they rang because a bell ringer wanted to show off. Either way, bells were everywhere. Now let's wander quietly into something a bit more symbolic: the waits. Waits were essentially early Christmas carolers, except they weren't volunteers. They were official town musicians, employed, paid, and tasked with walking around at night playing music to announce the hours. This was in part entertainment, in part security system, a medieval combination of holiday cheer and please don't burn the town down. Charming, slightly inconvenient, very Middle Ages. Let's drift softly into something a bit smaller, more intimate: the music inside homes. Peasant families didn't have instruments beyond maybe a flute or drum made from household scraps, but they sang, softly, repetitively, songs passed down through generations, songs about the nativity or local legends or moral lessons, songs that warmed the dark rooms when the fire burned low. Noble households, on the other hand, had more variety: harps, lutes, organs small enough to carry, troubadours and minstrels hired to perform as background ambiance. Nothing too lively, just enough to gently fill the space, enough to remind everyone that they were rich and had the luxury of paid musicians. And then there were the songs intended for children, simple lullabies with religious overtones, slow, soothing melodies meant to calm restless little ones in a world full of cold nights and creaking timber halls. Let's drift now into one more corner of medieval Christmas sound: plays and pageants. These performances often came with singing, chants, simple carols, or short refrains meant to guide the audience through the story. Nativity plays, saint plays, morality plays, all performed by amateurs who probably forgot their lines at least once. The music wasn't glamorous, but it added to the sense of community, ritual, and seasonal rhythm. And while these plays might seem unimpressive to us, in the Middle Ages they were major events. People gathered, they listened, they watched familiar stories come to life, and the music, soft, uneven, human, was part of what made it feel festive. Let's take a slow breath here and prepare to drift into another aspect of the medieval Christmas experience: the decorations, or rather, the lack of them. Because medieval Europe had some very strong decorating opinions, and most of them involved plants that could stab you,